everyone, it's Teacher Katie with another grammar point for you. Today we're doing part 2 of comparisons with as. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I recommend that you go back and watch that again. Let's get started. Last time we talked about positive comparisons and negative comparisons, and we used some math symbols to help us understand that. With positive comparisons, we talked about two things that were the same or equal, just like 1 equals 1. Our example sentence was, today is as cold as yesterday. We were comparing today and yesterday, and we were saying that the temperature was the same. The form we used was as, adjective as. When we talked about negative comparisons, we talk about things that are different. So, just like in math, 1 does not equal 2, we are saying that two things are not the same. Our sentence was, Texas is not as cold as Minnesota. The temperature in Texas is much warmer than Minnesota, so we were saying that those are very different climates. We used not as, adjective as. Today we are going to work on adding some adverbs into those comparisons. What do adverbs do again? Well, they modify or change verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs. Here's an example. Take the sentence, he is tall. If we add the word very, which happens to be an adverb, we are changing that sentence from he is tall to he is very tall. And we're showing that it's a greater degree. He is more tall in the second sentence. The adverbs we will use today are just, almost, nearly, and quite. Now, be careful with this last one. Many students confuse this word. Quite is the adverb that we are talking about today. But students often confuse this with quiet, which is an adjective that means not loud. Notice the difference in spelling. Quite has I-T-E and quiet has I-E-T. There's one more word I want you to be careful of. That's the word quit. This is the verb that means to stop. It looks like quite, but it's missing the final E. So notice the difference in sound between these words. Quite, quiet, quite, quiet, and quit. Now, let's learn how these adverbs can modify or change our comparisons with as. Now, here's the title screen again. You'll notice I have 3 math symbols. There's a reason I put those there. Let's look at the first one, the equal sign. You know this is our positive comparison. We used as, adjective, as already. But which one of those 4 adverbs can we add to make a positive comparison? Look at this picture. We have a boy and his mom. You can see by the red line that they are the same height. So we could say the boy is as tall as his mother. Or we could add the word just and say that the boy is just as tall as his mother. This means the same thing. So let's make a chart to help us remember. Here's our positive comparison. We know this form already. And here's our new one, just. Here's our sentence from earlier. The boy is as tall as his mother. And here's the new one. The boy is just as tall as his mother. Let's move on to the next math symbol, the almost equal sign. Another word that means almost or close to is the word approximate. Don't worry about that right now. What I want you to look at is the math to the right. The number 1 is almost equal to 0.9999999. They're not exactly the same, but they're very close. So we could say that they are approximate, or they are almost the same. Here's a picture of a boy and his sister. Notice that they're not exactly the same height, but they're very close. So, we can use almost to talk about how close they are in height. For this picture, we can use the sentence, "The boy is almost as tall as his sister." We can also say nearly. The boy is nearly as tall as his sister. This means the same thing. Almost as tall as or nearly as tall as both show that they are very close in height. So let's add this approximate comparison to our chart. Here we have our math symbol. 1 almost equals 0.99999. Then we have our almost, and then our nearly. And here are our two example sentences. The boy is almost as tall as his sister, and the boy is nearly as tall as his sister. Let's move on to that last math symbol, the does not equal sign. That's our negative comparison. Here's a picture of three people. Let's give them names to help make this easier. The woman on the left, let's call her Molly. The woman in the middle, let's call her Sharon. And the man, let's call him Tim. Now, I've drawn some red lines to help you see how different they are in height. We already know one type of negative comparison, not as tall as. We could say Sharon and Molly are not as tall as Tim. Let's learn two more. We could say not quite as tall as. Look at this sentence here. Molly is not quite as tall as Tim. Our third form is not nearly as tall as. Sharon is not nearly as tall as Tim. Now, I want to pay attention to these two right here. Not quite and not nearly, they don't mean exactly the same thing. In these sentences here, there's a reason that I said Molly is not quite as tall as Tim, and Sharon is not nearly as tall as Tim. Can you figure out what the reason is? Here's the picture again. Look at the difference in height. The difference between Molly and Tim's height is not really big. It's a small difference. But the difference between Sharon and Tim's height is a very big difference. So, adverbs help us know if there is a big difference or a small difference. So, can you guess which one we use for small difference and which one we use for big difference? Well, you guessed it. Molly is not quite as tall as Tim shows us the small difference. So we're going to use not quite for small differences. Sharon is not nearly as tall as Tim means a big difference. So we will use not nearly for big differences. Let's add that to our chart. We have our first form from part 1 of our lesson. Now we're going to add not quite and not nearly. Here are our three example sentences. Sharon and Molly are not as tall as Tim. Molly is not quite as tall as Tim. And Sharon is not nearly as tall as Tim. Now it's time for you to practice. Complete the sentences with just as, almost as, nearly as, not quite as, or not nearly as. I'll draw some lines so it's easier to see the difference. Go ahead and pause the video right now so that you can write these sentences in your notebook and complete the blank. Welcome back. Now it's time to talk about the answers. Number 1, circle B is just as large as circle C. Circle B and circle C are the same size, so we are going to use just as. Number 2, circle E is not nearly as large as circle A. You can see that the difference between circle E and circle A is a very big difference, so we're going to say not nearly as. Number 3, Circle D is almost as, nearly as, or not quite as large as circle C. Any of these are correct answer. We could say circle D is almost as large as circle C, or we could say circle D is nearly as large as circle C, or we could say circle D is not quite as large as circle C. Before we go on though, I want to point out something to you. If you use almost as or nearly as, you're thinking about this positively. You are thinking about how close they are in size. So, in this sense, you're thinking about not about the difference, but how close they are. But if you use not quite as large, you're actually thinking about the difference. You're thinking about this negatively. Number 4, circle D is not nearly as large as circle A. Again, the size difference between circle D and circle A is a pretty big difference, so we're going to use not nearly as. Finally, number 5, circle E is, you guessed it, you can use almost as, nearly as, or not quite as. Again, remember, if you use almost as or nearly as, you're thinking about how close they are in size. But if you use not quite as, you're thinking about how different they are in size. Let's do some more practice with this picture. We have a family of 5 people here. I want you to write at least 5 sentences comparing this family. Think about things such as how tall or how short they are, how old or how young they are, maybe how happy or how bored they are, or how good looking they are. Go ahead and write 5 sentences, and we'll see you in class to check the results. Thanks for watching.